Minutes for some more folks to come in. So we'll get started. Thank you for being here. This panel is the Medical Devices Panel, balancing improved healthcare technology and cost through innovative approaches to medical device development. It's being co-sponsored by MPR Associates and Aptive Solutions. I'm going to hand it over to Heather Erickson of Life Sciences Foundation, who will be moderating the panel. And there will be some time at the end for questions and answers, and I'll walk the microphone around at that time. Thank you.
Thank you, Julie. So maybe we can do a quick, we're going to introduce each of our panelists here. Again, I'm Heather Erickson, and President and CEO of the Life Sciences Foundation. On the far side of the stage here, we have Vicky Anastasi, who is the Senior VP of Medical Devices at Aptive, has been in the industry for 25 plus years, working in both diagnostics and devices, and really breadth and wealth of information I think we'll learn a lot from today. To her left, we have, I guess your right, we have John Weiler, who is a venture partner at SV Life Sciences. He's been with the firm there for 5 years, and previous to that was in the industry for quite a while with Abbott, TheraSense, and in the product development space. To John's left, your right, we have Joe Ferrara, who's president of Boston, going to switch. We have Brian Scrivens from MPR Associates, who's director of product strategy, where he's been involved in development processes, primarily again with devices and diagnostics, and before that was with BD and Coulter. And then Joe Ferrara is president of Boston Healthcare, where he's been for 18 years, is that right? With a long storied history working with global device and companion diagnostics, and a firm that has operations really all over the world. So with that, why don't we start off, maybe Vicki, you can help us understand a little bit about how are device companies approaching the use of innovative trial design as we're thinking about their product development strategies.
Sure. Well, welcome everyone, and thank you for the opportunity. Today, in today's paradigm of clinical trials, most companies can no longer do the traditional methods of designing a clinical study, starting your clinical study, collecting safety, collecting efficacy, then collecting reimbursement, and then going back and looking at your design to see if it worked. It costs a lot of time and money, and there's new technologies that are available to help create efficiencies and speed your time to market. Because the goal of all of us who work in the medical device industry or the biotech industry is to get transformational products on the market as quick as possible. So these new technologies are adaptive trial design and risk-based monitoring. From our perspective, because we're a global CRO, adaptive trial design sounds really complicated. It's actually, it is a very complicated statistical algorithm-based methodology, but it's very simple. It allows you to predetermine interim analysis to look at your data for a variety of endpoints. These are all pre-planned with regulatory bodies. Both the FDA and the EMA applaud these, they recommend these, and they actually validate the use of these protocols on a daily basis. Risk-based monitoring allows you to be much more cost efficient with when you actually start your trial. And it allows you to only go to a site, which is the main cost of conducting a clinical study, when there's risk at that site of data not being validated.
John, are you seeing this in some of the companies that you are looking at in terms of investment opportunities? Is this weighing in on your decisions?
Absolutely. So SV Life Sciences is a large, diversified healthcare venture capital and private equity fund. So we invest in biotech and devices, which is my focus, and hence are very involved with clinical trials. We also invest in clinical research organizations like Aptive that are delivering some of these new innovative trial design approaches. And I would say if you look at, within devices, but probably very much the same true in biotech, over the past decade, the cost of building new technologies and bringing them to market by virtue of the size of trials, the complexity of trials, the cost to run trials has increased dramatically. And so I think, we look very much to mitigate risk in terms of how we set up trials and set them up for success, and also managing costs. And I can think of several examples, in our medical device portfolio of companies we've invested in that have started using adaptive trial designs over the last several years, and probably a couple that we wish had. Just a couple kind of concepts that come to mind for me in terms of thinking of the risk and the dollars required. There are cases where we set up an interim analysis to basically look for futility because, we don't want to keep investing and enrolling a trial that's just simply never going to produce statistically significant results. Another case where we want to sort of keep the trial as small as possible to manage to meeting an endpoint and not more. We may have an interim analysis in another company I'm thinking of where they can essentially continue enrollment if they need additional patients to meet that endpoint. So I think we look at it as sort of a degree of freedom, a degree of flexibility that lets us not overspend on a trial that's going to fail, and also be able to adapt in terms of adjusting inclusion/exclusion criteria, for example, to make trials really meet that endpoint with the right target population.
Joe, you mentioned when we were talking earlier that sort of the statistically relevant information is a key part of what your firm does. Can you talk a little bit about how you see your work integrating and what your clients are asking for these days?
Sure. Our expertise, as you cited, is pricing, reimbursement, health economics, market access. And I would say that we've moved from a downstream consideration much further upstream in product development. Where we know at the end of the day that payers, clinicians, hospitals, anybody at financial risk for the technology is going to want to see evidence not just to support clinical utility, but also economic value. And I think that working with some of these innovative trial designs, I think, is essential in mitigating the risk of clinical development, but also building in up front some of these very important endpoints that we know payers will want to see. So that's been a big transformation in device development that we've seen over the last 5+ years.
And John, when you're looking at a potential investment opportunity again, so do you expect a company to have sort of all those endpoints figured out, or what type of?
I mean, listen, for a sort of early stage company that's just getting off the ground, of course there isn't the ability necessarily to have a very rigorous, well-detailed, clinical regulatory reimbursement plan. But I think really having the upfront thought is critically important. I mean, I think that sort of the routine maybe a decade ago in medical devices was, let's get the company started, build the product. Reimbursement is something we'll think about, hopefully after someone's bought the company. I think today we actually almost start with that question and say, ultimately in this healthcare environment, who's going to pay for a new technology? And so looking at, is there an existing reimbursement paradigm that a product can fit into, where if you win in a trial, someone will pay for it? Or do you really need to design and go down the path of a new reimbursement scheme, new trials that haven't been run before, and that just adds to both risk and timeline. So I think, even a company that's, sort of looking to raise their first $1 million, we would expect to have, have thought about it, have a position around kind of, what is the payment scheme into which this product fits, what's happening in terms of the dynamics within that specialty, within that product category. May not have the ultimate answer, but I think it much more so than the past, really thinking about those downstream market access questions in the beginning is critically important.
So Brian, you and your colleagues work a lot with that very early product development. So how do you help them through the process of figuring out what are the steps necessary, not just to get in a functioning, successful development?
Really understanding that whole case up front. If it's framed out, you don't have to have everything totally figured out, but you have to have a good basic understanding of where your device fits, what the indications are, and roadmap out where that's going to go. So the way we help people do that is actually through a management of design input requirements, and we work those in different strata of either patient cohorts or indications of use, so that these come out and are launched in an orderly way, and you're working on what matters now, as opposed to lots of bells and whistles that don't amount to added value.
So Vicki, how would a company like Aptiv work with some of the early stage development assistance that Brian is describing, sort of thinking about the development all the way through a actual clinical trial design?
I think it's, as Brian said, it's critically important to think about end users. Are they patients? Are they doctors? Who really is going to make the decision about how this device is going to be used? And how many different populations does it touch? So one of the things that you can look at in adaptive trial design is maybe your device is designed to touch multiple populations, multiple indications. And what we find with a lot of our emerging companies is that they don't want to narrow it down to one small area. They would like to have broader market entry. You would need to factor in your reimbursement possibilities on all those indications, the patient groups, the buying groups, how much investment money you have, and then you can design a study that allows you to look at all those different endpoints using interim analysis and stop some for futility, stop some early for efficacy. You can do population enrichment and continue to enroll so that you can meet a claim that's your key claim for a milestone for investment payment. So it allows you a degree of flexibility. So working closely with your design and development teams will enable you to get the most out of your clinical trial. It will allow you to have the most indications when you go to market with a well-designed study and a well-coordinated design program that's leading into clinical.
When we were talking earlier, you had mentioned a little bit about risk-based sort of approaches to this, and how would you advise a client to think about sort of maximizing their efficiency looking at a risk-based approach to their design and progress?
So the execution of a clinical study is critical, and I think as John alluded to, people love to enter clinical studies. It means you've hit a major milestone. It usually means you're looking to some sort of event where you're going to get more investment money or you're going to be bought. And it's the big data, it's the human data that's so critically important. What we find as a CRO that those either go well, I hope, if we're running it, but sometimes they just don't go well. And the execution of a clinical study is critical to get the appropriate evidence you need out of it, but also to be efficient so that you don't run out of money in the middle of your study. So risk-based clinical study approach really is a focus on using statistics to guide your study design. So you look at your clinical study, you design it about the risk for your study. A heart failure device has a lot more risk than a topical surface skin treatment. So you look at the risk, you use a validated statistical design, and you say, instead of spending $2 million in monitoring our sites every 2 weeks, we're going to have a pool of 30 site visits and only go for cause or when the site needs it. There's a tremendous amount of savings, and the other benefit is that because you're continually monitoring your data from a data management perspective, you're looking at your data daily or 24/7, and you can see trends, and you can constantly clean your data so that the quality of your data early in your study is there. So when you then go to look at your interim analysis, you can actually have a true picture. And you can report back to your investors, you can report to your reimbursement group that you're working with and say, here's our data, here's our interim analysis, and this is where we'd like to go. We want to make decisions based on this. So it's an efficiency model and a cost-saving model together.
So we talk.
I was going to say, I think a lot of these topics relate to some hard lessons learned across the industry with trials that have poor data monitoring and collection experiences and sort of non-conformities to protocols, et cetera, and have been tainted not because of the outcomes, but by the management of the trial. Or I think probably a lot of past history of rushing into a very large pivotal trial without really understanding patient selection, understanding sort of underlying statistics, et cetera. So I think a lot of these topics have evolved and become more sophisticated out of need. I mean, there's just been a lot of examples. For example, within medtech, I mean, we saw the Ardian trial headline last week, and can't say what that's quite about yet. But I think there's been a lot of big disappointments, and I think that the mindset, certainly at least from my perspective, is take the time to do it right and do more feasibility work, do more pilot studies to really define what that pivotal study should look like. And so I think the sophistication is hopefully moving things in a more robust direction.
And more data-driven.
Yeah, absolutely.
Maybe if each of you could share an example, if you can, of a company that you've worked with or has approached you when they went too far down the, we'll do it ourselves, we haven't done it before, but I'm sure we can figure out the statistic stuff and get it right the first time. And you had to either stop and restart them on a new path or perhaps redo a bunch of work that had already been done.
Well, I'll start. So we, again, are a CRO, so sometimes we get what's categorized as a rescue study. So, of course, we love them, but they are difficult because that means something's gone wrong somewhere out there. It's usually with data. There's usually something that hasn't been validated or isn't clean about the data. And it's usually an emergency. There's a regulatory meeting, there's a board meeting, there's an investor meeting, and someone has to report on the clinical study. So the company will come to us and say, this is what we did. Here's how we set up our protocol. Here's what our endpoint was. We're going to use all this data. We're going to get on the market in 17 countries, and we're going to get reimbursement immediately because we designed the study perfectly. And in reality, it was, as John said, they charged into a very large project without actually taking the time to look at what was going to happen if there was any data that wasn't meeting their claims or their endpoints, or there was any safety data that was unexpected that came up. What we usually do with that is we take a big step backwards. We look at the design. We may meet with the regulators. Normally we have to meet with the regulators. And in many cases, we have to rescope the breadth and depth of the study down to something that can be attainable with the funds in hand and with the time in the study. So that's our experience. These are usually not in what I would consider simple devices or diagnostics. These are usually in complex programs where the device is novel and innovative, or the diagnostics is a companion diagnostics where it's linked to some sort of therapeutic treatment, so that you have a layer of complexity that's causing these issues with the data.
I can think of an example that comes to mind, and different perspective as an investor coming into a company as opposed to redesigning and executing. But one that comes to mind, a company we invested in probably about 2.5 years ago, and then led a $45 million financing for a company in the structural heart space. And the company had been around for quite a long time, had something on the order of 40 patients of data, some of it on 5 years on an implant, which is pretty unusual for a company at that stage, and had exceptionally promising data, had an approved IDE for a pivotal study, and we're basically looking for financing to start that pivotal study, which is a 500 and something patient pivotal study in an area where there's been mostly failed trials in the past. So our view was we need to better understand our enrollment criteria, in which patients is this device most applicable. We need to understand control arm performance, and hadn't really had any experience with control arm. And sort of essentially what is the comparator in this trial. Needed to understand a bit more of sort of enrollment rate and sort of how do we project the cadence of the trial. So we said we will invest and lead this round, but we're going to take a different strategy. We're going to go spend 1.5 years in Europe. We're going to go treat another 100 patients. We're going to make sure that the data conforms, but also learn more about what we need to do in the pivotal trial. And that ultimately resonated, but I would say the experience in that additional time then led into a number of changes on the protocol for the pivotal trial, including adding an adaptive component. And so I think the story's not over yet, but I think we sleep better at night knowing that we had that input to then come up with a more robust protocol.
And also to look at the design in the market. I think that was, because I know that client too,
Yeah.
And it was very interesting because they immediately called us and said, we have an adaptive protocol. Very, very excited about the fact that they had moved into that. And but it was a major step because they did do some redesign of their device after Europe to make it the usability more, and also to look at what the patient population would be and how broad of a patient population they could collect from market entry. So it was an interesting strategy.
Joe, on the tail end, do you see?
Definitely. So, your question was when we've come in, maybe, and had we come in earlier, we could have taken a different route. I think a rare example, but we do see sometimes as a product configuration example, the one that I'll give is disposable negative pressure wound therapy. I think a lot of people were tripped up on this. It's a great idea, but Medicare doesn't reimburse for disposable durable medical equipment. It's, by its definition, not workable. So there's a gap in a large percentage of your population that's simply not reimbursable with that tool because of the configuration of the product. So that's one example we see. The other one is what I'll call the evidence gap, which is getting through the agency, getting on the market, and then finding that there's this long valley, a very dry, sunny, hot valley where we can't get payers to pay for the technology because we haven't looked at their evidence requirements, or whoever's at financial risk for the technology. So are we dealing with practice level economic data we needed to collect? Is it population level economics? And do we have the tools to communicate that value? And we see this in two forms. We see it with smaller emerging players, and we also see it with large global players who acquire a smaller player only to find that in fact they don't have the complete evidence set to achieve what I would call adoption beyond the core group of key opinion leaders or those early adopters and move something to the standard of care, which is what the large device players are aiming to do. So yeah, it's an acute issue, absolutely.
Brian, do you have many companies that are coming to you and saying, gosh, we really need to just start from the beginning again? We messed up at first step in our product design and we've been stumbling ever since.
Yeah, we have, as I was thinking about this, I'm thinking I would probably separate our customers into two categories. The first set are those who come to us